Hello, and welcome to the It's Not TV episode of Slate Money, your guide to the business and finance of, it turns out this week, the entertainment industry. I'm Felix Salmon of Axios. I'm here with my colleague Emily Peck.
Hello, hello.
I'm here with Elizabeth Spiers.
Hello.
And we have another Felix, the best Felix on the show this week.
All right.
Felix Gillette, introduce yourself.
I'm Felix Gillette. I'm the other Felix in the media that does business stuff. I sometimes answer Felix Salmon's email and phone calls inadvertently. It has happened over the years. I work at Bloomberg. I'm a writer and editor at Bloomberg and co-author with my friend John Copeland of the New York Times of It's Not TV, The Spectacular Rise, Revolution, and Future of HBO.
We're going to talk about HBO a lot. We are going to talk about the rest of the entertainment industry. We're going to talk about, whether Max is a better name than Felix or HBO. We're going to talk about the NFL and boxing. We're going to talk about PewDiePie and YouTube in the Slate Plus segment. We're going to talk about sexism in the numbers round. We have a bunch of stuff to get through. And of course, because we have to, we're going to talk about Rupert Murdoch quite a lot. It's all coming up on Slate Money. Slate Money is sponsored this week by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day, but which policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, unpacking the stories making news in Washington and how they may affect your finances and your portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Apple Card gives you unlimited cash back every day on every purchase. It's real cash you can spend right away. No need to wait and wait for rewards. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone to see your credit limit offer with no impact to your credit score. Subject to credit approval, daily cash is available via an Apple Cash card or as a statement credit. See Apple Card customer agreement for terms and conditions. Apple Cash Card is issued by Green Dot Bank, member FDIC. Accepting an Apple Card after your application is approved will result in a hard inquiry, which may impact your credit score.
So seeing as how you've just published an entire book about HBO, why not start with HBO?
Yeah.
Which, is it true that HBO Max is going to be rebranded as just Max?
I think that is true. That's what I've been hearing. Just Max.
And then, basically all of us who don't do linear television anymore, which is going to be most people pretty soon, the HBO brand is just going to be some weird, button in Max.
There'll be a tab on Max. Just like, on Disney Plus, there's a tab for National Geographic. In some ways, I think it's good because I think the initial idea to name the whole streaming service HBO Max was confusing. It was like, we're going to broaden the service. You know what HBO was. HBO was this prestigious thing, and it was, somewhat of a niche network, and they wanted to make it something for everybody. And so I think, the idea of this masstige play where you take a prestige brand and take it down market, I think is a smart move in the short term. But I think there are risks in the long term because eventually you just end up diluting the brand. I mean, I think, this has happened hundreds of times in retail before.
I mean, that was what happened to Gucci in the 70s,
yeah,
right?
Gucci, Cadillac. I mean, everyone tries it because, in the short term, it's great. Suddenly you can broaden the base and tell everybody, oh, you're getting this incredibly special thing for much less, and it's going to appeal to more people.
Is there a good example of a show that is on HBO Max and that managed to get a kind of halo effect from being on HBO Max, even though it wasn't really technically HBO?
Yeah, I think so. Hacks, I think most people, if you ask them, you're like, is that a HBO show or an HBO Max show? I think most people would think that was an HBO show, but it wasn't. And I think it benefited from the history of HBO branding and comedy and,
Do you think that most consumers even register these brand shifts? Because I get confused about which prestige show is on which streaming service.
It's really hard. Every couple of years, there's a new website which you're meant to go to, can I stream it or just watch or something, where you type in the name of the show and it may or may not tell you where it may or may not be streaming.
Yeah. I think that's part of the problem that the streamers are having is that, you want to watch the shows you want to watch. You're not going to subscribe to just one of the services. You're usually going to subscribe to a couple, and you're going to end up getting frustrated when it doesn't have the one show you want to watch. And, it's like, oh, I want to see Fleischman's in Trouble. And it's like, wait, that's not on HBO. That's not on Netflix. That's not on Paramount Plus.
The great thing about that, and we had this conversation with Taffy, was like, it was on something called FX, but it wasn't on FX. The only way you could see it was on Hulu. And I was talking to someone from Hulu about this, and they were saying Netflix and HBO Max always wind up getting the most Emmy nominations.
Oh, yeah.
Except for apparently Hulu gets the most if you don't separate it out between Hulu and FX. But they do separate it out, and it gets very confusing.
Yeah, you got to pile them all into one brand to compete
it's
these
so
days.
Confusing. How
It's
many
so
are there?
confusing.
There's Paramount and Peacock. That throws me. I think that's the one that just threw me over the edge. Two different.
Clearly,
feeds.
at some point, if you fast forward this whole thing 5-10 years down the road, they're going to consolidate more, right? Nobody wants five or six seasons.
How many are there going to be? Three.
Who will they be?
It'll be Disney Plus, it'll be Netflix, and it'll be all the other services in one.
What happens to Apple? Do they get out of the business entirely, or do they wind up getting much, 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 much bigger?
I don't know. This period that we're in right now, I think will determine that. Because right now, all of the legacy players like HBO Max, like Peacock, like Paramount Plus, they're all under a lot of pressure suddenly to stop losing so much money. And so they're going to have to pull back. People are talking about, it's the end of peak TV. But for Apple and for Amazon, they have no such pressures, right? I mean, they have other issues going on in the economy, but basically it's always been a loss leader for them anyways. They're not measuring their profitability of these streaming services in the same way as their competition. And so if they want to go out right now, and while everybody else is pulling back, if they want to just start spending like crazy, I think it is a moment where they could really pull away. And you see, YouTube TV just got the NFL Sunday ticket, right? Google's like, sure, we'll pay $2 billion a year for this thing that's clearly going to lose a lot of money in the short term, but we're going to pull more people into our TV ecosystem. Amazon has, NFL rights now. Amazon paid more than $1 billion for the Lord of the Ring prequel series. And again, there's no economic sense to that other than we're pulling you in, we're getting more Prime subscribers, we can hang on to them. So they're not under the same pressure as Netflix, as HBO Max.
I did want to ask you about sports. I'm glad you mentioned tickets, which, I don't know. I'm very unclear how tickets work, but I know that the NFL is insanely sophisticated about how it divvies up its games and sells them off for maximum revenue. Do you consider sports to be a central part of the entertainment industry?
Yes.
And it's the one part which, weirdly, it's where Rump Fox is still a really big player, right?
Yeah. And it's going to be more important in this coming phase because suddenly, look at Netflix, for example. Their whole existence up to this point, they've been advertising free and sports free.
Yeah.
And now suddenly, Wall Street's saying, we're not going to value you the same way. We want to see profits. And what happens? We're going to add an advertising tier to our service. But the problem is if the whole service has always been a, binge operating, evergreen, on-demand thing, you need for advertisers to get people to show up at a certain time, at a certain place.
Is that important to advertisers that people see the ad at a certain time rather than that they just see the ad at some point?
Not for 100% of the advertising, but for a lot of them. You have a car sale going on, if you have a movie premiere happening, you need to get people to watch the thing at the right time. And that's why sports are so important, because it's a live event. It happens at a specific time. Everyone wants to tune in at that time. And so I think in order to really max out and optimize their new growing advertising business for Netflix, but also for Warner Brothers Discovery and HBO Max, who are also playing around with advertising on these streaming services, Amazon, everyone that wants to do this to grow their advertising on these streaming services, they're going to need live events. And yeah, you can do it somewhat with music concert. You can do it somewhat with comedy. But really what we're talking about is sports.
Is the ad buying process more akin to broadcast or digital video ad buys? Or is it some hybrid of the two?
It's definitely a hybrid of the two. But I think they're figuring that out. And a lot of it is going to depend. I mean, right now it's kind of a crazy time too because they're adding all these new advertising options at a time when the advertising market is pretty weak right now. A lot of advertisers are pulling back. And it is this big shift happening in digital advertising where, Facebook and Google have just dominated that space for the past 5-10 years. And suddenly everyone's pulling back at a time when the grip of Google and Facebook on that market seems to be letting up a lot. You have TikTok, you have, Netflix, you have multiple big players coming into that space, Amazon making a huge play in the digital advertising space. So I think, I don't know, it's all going to shake out in the next 2 or 3 years.
Support for this podcast comes from Wise, the universal account that lets you send, spend, and receive money internationally. With one account for over 50 currencies, who exactly is Wise made for? It's made for jet setters and slow travelers, for seeing old friends in new places. Wise is made for business in the city and pleasure on the coast, for studying abroad and supporting your little brother's schooling back home. Wise is made for people without borders who want to live truly global lives with ease. You see, with Wise, you always get the mid-market exchange rate whenever you convert or spend different currencies. There are no markups and no hidden fees. That's pounds to pesos, dollars to dong, just like that. Helping you save on currency conversion wherever your money takes you. Wise. It's the account that's made for the world. Join 13 million customers and learn how the Wise account could work for you at wise.com/slatemoney.
Slate Money is sponsored this week by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But which policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise will help you answer that question. It's an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, and it covers the stories making news right now. Hosted by Mike Townsend, who's Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, it takes a non-partisan look at the stories that matter most to investors. Tune in to hear about the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes, and trade, or hear about inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. So download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This episode of Slate Money is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You are not just listening to Slate Money, are you? Be honest, you are probably doing something else at the same time. You are cleaning or exercising or walking down the street or grocery shopping, but so long as you're not in a moving vehicle, there is something else you could be doing right now, which is getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. So multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts are not available in all states and situations. Let me just quickly follow up on this question about tentpole advertising opportunities, aka sports. Mm-hmm. Let's say, to use your example, I am a movie studio and I have a big movie coming out on Friday, mm-hmm. and I want to get everyone into the movie theater, so I want to advertise it. Why is it better for me to advertise on a big American football game on Thursday than it is to just go to Netflix and say, just reach all of your people on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday and just do all of the ads all weekend? Why is the getting a bunch of people all seeing the ad at the same time better than just a bunch of people seeing the ad over a period of a few days?
I think it's easier if they're all amassed in one place. It's an easier transaction than trying to aggregate all those different groups across an on-demand platform. I think there's a somewhat of a...
Wait, hang on. Now, you see, I think this is so obvious to you. It's not obvious to me because I don't think these ways. Yeah. It's about reaching a certain target audience, right? And that if you are just aggregating across Netflix, then Netflix will just wind up serving that ad to that broad Netflix audience. But if what you really want is to reach the 15 to 25-year-old men... then that's going to be harder on broad Netflix than it is if you have like a sports show on.
Definitely.
Right.
And it's also going to hit that viewer in a different way. I mean, if you're watching something live and there's some drama involved and you're somewhat attached to that drama, you're going to experience those advertisements in a slightly different way than if you're casually watching something on demand and pausing it and then like, I can always watch this later.
The adjacencies actually matter. Like some shows, are we seeing that already, that some shows have higher prestige and therefore higher demand from advertisers?
Yeah. And I think also, that's one way in which the old HBO model, and the old network TV model is suddenly coming back into vogue a little bit. You think about like 5-10 years ago, people were always complaining, like Netflix puts all of its dramas. If you want to watch a new season of a drama, they put all the episodes on the surface at once. You can just watch them at your own leisure. Why does HBO keep doing one episode a week? But now we're seeing with shows like White Lotus, where you can get people to show up every Sunday, watch the new episode, talk about it. There's still a lot of value of delivering that audience at a particular time.
How existential is this flight of the NFL to streaming, to the networks? Could a network ever go out of business?
I think it's incredibly existential threat. I don't think the networks are in any risk at this point of losing the NFL completely. But if you look at linear television right now, Sportico had a nice little graphic this morning that in 2022, of the top 100 telecasts, 82 of them were NFL games.
Whoa.
And so that's why people are showing up to watch that television on the wall at a certain time. It's almost entirely NFL. Now, there were also some World Cup games. There was Kentucky Derby, some NBA games. But it's really the NFL and television. They're like the clownfish and the anemone. They can't.
Which is which?
I don't know, but they need each other. Yeah. They're symbiotic creatures, and they have been for a long time. And the more dire the situation gets for the traditional TV universe, the more important those NFL games are. The kind of genius of the way the NFL has done their TV rights and their broadcasting rights is they haven't just moved entirely to one new player. They just keep slicing up little bits of it and selling those off. And so, Amazon, had Thursday Night Football for the first time this season. They didn't get as many views as the previous setup which was, the NFL Network and CBS, but they still proved that they could put on these live games. People would show up, advertisers would buy the space, the technology worked. And I'm sure everyone is pretty happy about that. I think you're going to see the other major sports leagues, they're already doing it. But like the NBA, they're just going to do the same thing. When their rights are up, they're going to carve out more and more pieces to sell to the Amazons, the Apples, the Googles.
Are we going to see sports ownership and media ownership more and more overlapping? We already see it a bit with like the Dolan family, with the Yankees own like a TV network. Is that as live sports becomes more important to media, at some point we're going to see maybe even Disney buying? I guess they had one. Did they have a hockey team at some point?
They, there have been historic, people have bought sports teams, but an entire league would be a new thing. I think the most interesting story right now in media in this field is to watch what happens with WWE, the major wrestling promotion, because, that is a $5 billion business. It's not sports per se, but it's live action that gets people to sit in the seat at a particular time. They have a very dedicated audience.
It's sports. How is it not sports?
Well,
It's all
scripted.
choreographed.
It's drama.
All right, it's scripted sports. There's unscripted sports and scripted sports.
It's not
like,
real.
Scripted sports? What are you talking
Felix,
about?
I hate to break this to you, but none of it is real.
Santa Claus is. No.
Sports is spontaneous. You don't know what. No one knows what's going to happen.
Well, no one knows what's going to happen in wrestling either.
No,
except for
people
like
know.
three people.
The people doing the wrestling. It's all planned out.
So if you
By
haven't
the way, can I just
It's
say, like,
theater.
is there any better word in English than kayfabe? I love that word so much.
And it's now politics is completely, derived from, the wrestling world. I think if you haven't been following it, it's worth checking in on the WWE drama just yesterday. So last year, the Wall Street Journal had a series of articles that Vince McMahon, he's the CEO of the WWE, he's been the most important person in the whole wrestling universe for the past 40, 50 years. The Wall Street Journal came out with a series of articles that he had made these payouts, over allegations of sexual harassment, inappropriate relationships with coworkers. He retired, stepped back, said, "Okay, I'm done. I'm, in my late 70s. I'm stepping away. I'm retiring." In the first week of January, news comes out that now Vince McMahon wants to come back in. He wants to unretire. He wants to take control of the whole operation again. He wants to join the executive. And part of the reason for that is because, again, it all comes back to this issue of advertising and TV rights, which is that currently the WWE splits its performances between NBC Universal, they air on Peacock, the streaming service, and USA Network on cable TV. And then Fox, Rupert has another chunk of shows. And that deal is going to be coming up. And so that puts WWE in this interesting position where they can deliver a very dedicated audience at a particular time, several nights a week, at this time when all the streamers want that, right? So clearly all of these streaming services are going to be fighting over these rights.
Except for Netflix, which doesn't do live.
But I think they're going to have to move in that direction. And so also, if you look at the share price for WWE is actually way up over the past year. And
as a takeover candidate.
Yes, because everyone thinks they're going to sell to somebody. And that would be basically the equivalent of one of these companies swallowing an entire league to make it exclusive.
And the potential acquirer could be Amazon.
Yep.
It probably couldn't be Warner Brothers Discovery because they're too indebted already.
They also have a rival wrestling promotion, AEW, which has gotten traction over the past year. Tony Khan, the Khan family, they own the Jacksonville Jaguars. They started this new wrestling promotion. And while WWE has had this chaotic year with Vince retiring, and, they don't have a superstar in wrestling right now. John Cena he stepped away to go do his Hollywood stuff. WWE always does better when they have one massive superstar, Hulk Hogan, John Cena, The Undertaker. They don't have that right now. So it's kind of opened up the window. There's this new wrestling promotion. It's very tied in with Warner Brothers Discovery. So they see a window and they see an opportunity there. So they would be the one major media tech company that I think would not. They also have too much debt to take on anything more. But everybody else, it's a $5 billion company. It's like...
But, Tim Cook would never buy a wrestling league.
It seems unlikely, but, get into it. Someone could convince him. It's, family-friendly-ish these days. It's, went through a period where it was a little bit more violent and risque.
So talking about
dialed that back.
Violence, like how much of the rise of HBO was boxing related and what happened to boxing?
That's a good question. Boxing was a key part of the HBO formula in its early days. So when HBO was initially conceived in the 1970s, the idea was the home box office. So it was like anything we were going to put on the air, things that you typically in the past would have had to go out and buy a ticket for. So it was like movies, comedy performances, music concerts, and sporting events. And, the whole time as they were thinking...
I never actually worked that one out. Like the thing that all of these things have in common is they have little physical box offices where you buy a ticket.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And they were also at the same time trying to figure out how do we counter program against traditional broadcast television, which at that point, there were 3 big networks. This is even pre-Fox. So it was just ABC, NBC, CBS. They dominated the free over-the-market, culture. So they didn't want to go head-to-head with the broadcast network. So they wanted to do things differently. And at that point in the early 80s, there was the broadcast networks were backing off of boxing, which was perceived as too violent. It was, advertisers were wary of sponsoring it. And so that left an opening for HBO. They said, well, we don't have advertisers. And at the same time, we're trying to do things differently than the network. We can dive in, pay a huge amount of money for one sport, put it on the air. And, their timing was actually really good because boxing in the 80s was really big. They got right in on the Mike Tyson phenomenon from the early, from the start. They identified Tyson as a rising star. They got him to fight, most of his fights on HBO. There's all sorts of funny stories if you talk to people who were at HBO in the 80s. Mike Tyson was like a presence at the office, like they would sneak him into meetings to jump out.
HBO was basically Mike Tyson's employer at that point.
Basically. And if you think about it, he was really their first archetype of what a successful HBO figure was. And I think the evolution from Mike Tyson to Tony Soprano, once you start looking at it, is pretty direct.
I love this in your book. I mean, it was so, once you started talking about it, it was so obvious. It was like both anti-heroes, both very tough, but had a heart of gold, and both obsessed with birds to some degree.
Yeah, they love birds.
Incredible.
Mike Tyson had his pigeons and Tony had his backyard ducks.
Can we take a little tangential discussion? Because I read your book, the part of your book where Howard Cosell, the sports announcer, is calling a boxing match on network television, and it's incredibly violent, and Cosell just can't take it anymore and is saying this is awful, etc. I think I read that, and then 2 days later, Damar Hamlin of the Buffalo Bills, got hit during a game, and the game stopped, and there was kind of this moment where everyone was like, oh my God, how can the NFL go on? There was all these stories about how violent it is. And I was thinking how different those two moments are and why that would be. And maybe part of the reason is network television is so dependent on the NFL. And back then they weren't dependent on boxing at all. Anyway, I was hoping you could talk about it for a second.
Yeah, that's a fascinating parallel. And I think part of the difference is that, with the NFL, every time something happens, and this was a very unusual case, but immediately afterwards people said, well, are people going to stop watching the NFL because a player almost dies on the field? But maybe 5-10 years ago, when we started learning about all the brain damage that football causes, and people were having really serious moral conversations with themselves, should I be supporting the sport? Should I watch this? This is inhumane. We know it's these players are going to have long-term damage from this. And then people kind of just kept watching, right?
Yes.
And we all know it causes brain damage. And even so, the ratings have not fallen down at all. And so I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical that anyone sees this particular episode, as horrifying as it was and upsetting as it was. I really don't think it's going to put any kind of dent into NFL viewership. Why is that different than what happened with boxing? I think part of it is in the boxing world, there were a series, it was the Howard Cosell fight, but previously there was another fight in which one of the boxers actually died, right? He got knocked down, hit his head on the canvas, was rushed to the hospital, had brain swelling, passed away. And, watching a human being get killed in the ring by another person where the intention is, it looks as though they're trying to kill them, I think hit people in a really one way. And it did have an impact. The advertisers did back away from it. The sport didn't go away. It went to HBO. It went away from advertisers and sponsorships. People have made that comparison in the past. Could, American style football, could the same thing happen to that sport as it did to boxing? And so far that hasn't happened. But I would also say boxing's decline took 20, 30 years.
Do you think part of it, though, is because you don't see the effects of the the injury directly in front of you on the field when you're watching.
Yeah.
Which is,
it doesn't show up. I mean, the brain damage typically, it's 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So it's less dramatic. You can definitely compartmentalize when you're watching the sport. You're not seeing the players you love from 20 years ago in this decrepit, terrible position that they find themselves in. It is a little bit easier to put it out of your mind.
I mean, you could say the same thing about ballet is really bad for you, especially if you're a woman. It fucks up your feet. It's really bad for your long-term health. You do really unnatural things to your body. People have known this for decades as well. And
that's why I don't watch ballet.
Yeah, that's why.
It's a moral position on my part.
But I was also wondering, another reason the situation is different now with the NFL than it was with boxing is what we talked about before, which is that the NFL is existentially necessary to a whole ecosystem of television networks and advertisers and sportscasters. They don't have the freedom, or maybe they feel more restricted in doing what Cosell did, decades ago. You can't do that anymore. You need the NFL.
If it's all driven by advertisers, ultimately, I think there's definitely a case to be made, but tell me if this is true, that advertisers need the NFL way more, orders of magnitude more than they ever needed boxing.
Completely. Yeah, hugely important. I mean, there's not that many. I mean, as the entire cultural landscape has splintered, the opportunities to have mass events with people watching have just gotten fewer and fewer and fewer. And the NFL is really the only thing left that does it at the magnitude it still does it, and does it, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 weeks a year.
What is it? I think Sarah Fisher had a chart over at Axios, but the 19th most popular NFL game is still going to be more popular than the Oscars.
Yeah, way more popular. It can be a terrible game. That's the thing also. You're that was a horrendous game. It's putting up bigger numbers than anything else. And all those other shows, I mean, it's sometimes fun to watch, to go back and look at the ratings for, dramas in cable television just 10 years ago. If you look at what The Walking Dead was, the number of people watching that, and then watch that viewership decline. And The Walking Dead for a long time was still the most popular show on all of cable, even as its audience dropped by 80%. I mean, it is pretty wild how the audience is splintered, and it's tough to get that back. So yeah, I do think the NFL advertisers are hugely dependent on it.
And Fox News is the other thing that has a big audience still, right?
Well, yes, let's talk a little bit about Fox, because Fox was this major studio. It had massive movie operations. It had massive TV operations. It then sold, 80% of itself to Disney?
Yeah.
And then that rump 20%, financially speaking, is much smaller. It seems too small to succeed in this media landscape of behemoths. But it only does two things, which is news and sports. And it does them both, in a pretty dominant way.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Rupert saw the market at its peak and sold. I mean, and he sold all of those cable networks right before they had this huge decline. And if you look at the people that held on, I mean, AMC Networks is a good counterexample. Speaking of The Walking Dead, AMC Network, a few years ago, everyone's like, oh, this is such an incredible business. They have this cable network. People love watching these dramas. And, they didn't sell at the same time, and they held on. And now the Dolans are holding this thing that is, really in trouble because people aren't watching cable anymore. So I think the people
Are you saying that Rupert Murdoch is a savvier businessman than Jimmy Dolan?
Yeah, I think that could maybe be said. And he sold those cable networks to Disney at the right time. He decided he was not going to build a giant streaming service, in part because he tried to acquire Time Warner. As you recall, he made a bid. Time Warner fought it off. And after that deal fell through, I think they realized either you have to get enormous, you have to get so big that you can compete with Netflix and the $20 billion a year they're spending on programming, or you're going to get wiped out. And without the Time Warner assets, they said, you know what, we're going to sell. We'll hold on to those pieces that are still somewhat work in the cable, traditional TV ecosystem, which is, news and sports. and those assets still deliver audiences. But they got rid of everything else and let Disney try and hash out what they were going to do with all the streaming services.
Let me ask you about the other huge bet that Murdoch made, which was also a much smaller bet that I made. I made a bet with my colleague Nathan Bomey about the box office revenues for Avatar 2, which is just the longest, dumbest, video game that you can't play. I haven't even seen it, but I have yet to meet a single person who likes this movie.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is just going to be a fiasco. And it's the opposite of a fiasco. It is making enormous box office figures, not only globally, but even in the United States. How does a movie that no one likes make so much money?
I think there's only one logical explanation for this, because I've thought about this a lot too. The only logical explanation is that I'm pretty sure James Cameron must have made a deal with the devil at some point. I think he had to have sold his soul and then been like, everything I make will turn into one of the top 10 movies of all time. Because it is baffling. And when
I have a theory.
Yes. You have a theory? What's the theory?
Which is that because I have a 7-year-old and we take him to movies a lot, there was a sort of famine of kid-friendly movies, and because it's animated essentially, and it works kind of across age levels.
Did you take your 7-year-old to Avatar?
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's
he was ambivalent about it. Was it? Also, we let the 7-year-old watch age-inappropriate stuff all the time, and his favorite movie is Everything Everywhere All at Once. So his tastes are a little weird.
It's a sophisticated 7-year-old. I'm impressed he could do the 3 hours. I don't know. It's also weird that there's 2 movies, big blockbuster movies at the same time with if you watch Black Panther 2, there's a whole race of blue underwater people in that movie also.
Oh, maybe it's just a blue underwater people.
I don't know. Is there some archetype for that matters to people? I can't think of any. It's like the Smurfs, they weren't underwater, but they were pretty popular too. I don't know. People like blue creatures.
So we're on the subject. We've managed to somehow get onto the subject of movie theaters.
Yes.
They're basically dead, right? That's doomed.
It's a tough business, I would say. What do you think? I think movie theaters will survive, but not at the level they were pre-pandemic. This year, the box office, it's missing about 1/3 of what it was before the pandemic. And part of that is because there were less big movies that came out this year. But part of it is there are whole sections of movies that feel like you might as well just watch them at home. I go to the movie theater basically when I want to take my kids and get them out of the house and be lazy and not have to actually entertain them myself. And that there's some value in that. And there's some value in seeing things together as a group and on a big screen. But I do think, it's just a crazy world for those movie theater chains. And, AMC has been an incredible story to watch. I think watch Adam Aron, as the head of this company that went through this huge expansion right before everything fell apart. They bought all these other chains. They were expanding in Europe, and then it grinds to a halt. They suddenly are holding all these multiplexes everywhere. Nobody's going to the theater. And, they managed to stave off bankruptcy largely through this crazy meme stock phenomenon and by convincing a bunch of retail investors that they should have an affinity for this brand, which really is not very much. Historically, would you be able to tell the difference between an AMC theater or a Regal theater?
Wait, is there any difference?
No, I don't think so.
This is one of the interesting things. Alamo Drafthouse declared bankruptcy and came out of bankruptcy bigger than when it went in.
Yeah.
You don't see that very often.
Alamo is a differentiated product, though.
Right.
I love Alamo, and I want Alamo to succeed. But in the end, am I willing to drive 40 minutes to go to an Alamo theater to see a movie versus if it's 10 minutes to go to an AMC? I'll still choose the AMC.
This is why you should live in downtown Manhattan. There's one just around the corner.
Yeah. Tim League, who's the head of Alamo Drafthouse, has done an incredible job of making that experience feel different. I mean, not just because of the dine-in food, but because of the previews you see ahead of time. There's no advertising. The fact that you feel like you're learning something about cinema by what they show you ahead of time. The cleverness of the stunts they do. Years ago, I remember I was living in Austin. First time I'd heard of Alamo Drafthouse, they were doing Deep Water, which was one of those like shark movies. And they put a screen on the lake and you got an inner tube and you went out and floated on the lake and watched this thing. And then they had people like in little scuba, outfits going down and like grabbing people's ankles and freaking people out.
Oh my God.
But there's like cleverness to that. And I think, can they do it on like a scale at the same level as like an AMC where it's like in every shopping mall across the country? I don't think that's quite possible. No. But also the decline of the movie going experience is also, I think it's hard to separate from the decline of the shopping mall experience.
So I have a theory about this, which is that the movie going experience has become supersized. And that what we've had in the movies is actually not dissimilar to what we see in like the way that people used to go to the Met or to MoMA to see their Van Gogh shows. Mm-hmm. And now they go to the Van Gogh experience in order to experience it in fully immersive, grand, blah, blah, blah. And the movies that do big box office are the vibey, immersive, experiential ones, which are very loud and very colorful and don't make you think very hard. And the cinéma, as the French would put it, has absolutely moved into people's homes where they have incredibly great sound systems now, incredibly great televisions. And what's more, you are much less constrained in terms of time. So you're not in this world where 3.5 hours is a long movie. You're in a world where how long is, a standard series like White Lotus is 8 hours long. I think Stranger Things is like 13 hours or something. You have so much more time to do like highbrow things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, to bring it back to HBO, I think like when HBO decided to start making serialized shows in the mid-90s, I think one of the things that made a huge difference culturally is they decided, we're going to basically take a page from independent movies. And a lot of those creators that made those early HBO series, they were people who worked in broadcast television, who had success in broadcast television, were really sick of the rules of working in broadcast television, and basically had these fantasies of going off and making indie movies. And HBO said, yeah, you can come over here and make your indie project with us, which is what happened with Darren Star and Sex and the City. He didn't think that was going to be a big hit. He thought of it as a little indie project. David Chase, who'd worked in broadcast television forever, that was the pitch again with HBO. Come here and we'll let you do what you always wanted to do, only instead of making an hour and a half, you'll get 10 hours to do it. And at the same time, we'll give you a huge amount of money to put on the screen. We can't pay you as much. You're not going to get the residuals down the road. There's not going to be the syndication that you would have made from broadcast television. But we are going to give you money to go shoot out in the field. You're going to be doing this, with David Chase and The Sopranos, you can go out and do a lot of exterior shots in New Jersey. You don't have to do it on a sound stage in Los Angeles. And that feeling, that look, that whole movement of what you went to independent film to see very quickly migrated to television. And you started, having these shows, the prestige dramas where you're like, yeah, I can get that same adult level of exploration of people's psyches and relationships and cultural movements, and I can get that at home. And I don't have to go to the theaters.
And then once a quarter or so, I will want to do something dumb and immersive, and I'll go and see Maverick or I'll go and see Avatar, and that'll be my movie going experience.
Yeah, take the whole family out and go to the theater and see something big.
And, ideally at an IMAX.
Yes, 3D with little blue people swimming.
Yay, 3D blue people.
It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Apple Card gives you unlimited cash back every day on every purchase. It's real cash you can spend right away. No need to wait and wait for rewards. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone to see your credit limit offer with no impact to your credit score. Subject to credit approval, daily cash is available via an Apple Cash card or as a statement credit. See Apple Card customer agreement for terms and conditions. Apple Cash Card is issued by Green Dot Bank, member FDIC. Accepting an Apple Card after your application is approved will result in a hard inquiry, which may impact your credit score.
The Daily Drive podcast brings you all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. I'm Jamie Butters, executive editor of Automotive News.
And I'm Kellen Walker. We give you all the top stories each weekday and interviews with experts like Mike Dunn explaining Jeep struggles in China.
How bad did it get? As recently as June, sales of Jeeps in China. Can you guess the number, Jamie?
Oh gosh, was it 4 digits?
It was 1 digit. And the number was 1.
Listen and subscribe to Daily Drive at autonews.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
We should have a numbers round.
Yes.
Elizabeth, do you have a number?
I do. The American Time Use Survey came out. BLS releases it.
Well, what's the number?
So the number is 4.4, which is the amount of happiness that people in agricultural, forestry, and logging rate on a scale of 1 to 6 as the amount of happiness they experience in their job. And that puts them at the top of the Time Use Survey in terms of careers that make people the most happy.
I can tell you that, for reasons which we are not going to go into, I wind up seeing a bunch of people chopping logs on TikTok. and those people seem very happy.
Maybe they've seen the survey because lumberjacks are at the top of it. And at the bottom of it are people who work in finance and insurance who rate their jobs as a 3.6 on happiness and a 2.9 on levels of stressfulness.
Yeah. Quit your finance job and go chop logs. You know who did that? Neil Kashkari. Do you remember that? When at the end of the financial crisis, he left the U.S. Treasury and he decided he was burned out. And then there was this big Washington Post profile of him, like in a lumberjack shirt with an axe, like chopping things in the forest, because that was his way of becoming happy. And then, then he decided he was going to run for Senate in California. So he obviously didn't learn anything.
I would say if anybody was likely to see a survey like that and give it a try, that
would be Neil Kashkari.
Yes.
Emily, do you have a number?
I do. I have a number. I stole it from Felix's book. Not you, Felix Salmon. My number is $100,000. That is how much money Candace Bushnell made, according to Felix's book, from Sex and the City on HBO, which is not a lot of money compared to what everyone else did.
Is she going to go back and try and get more?
I think it's too late.
It's way too late.
Yeah, she sold the rights to Darren Star after she'd written a profile of him for Vogue. And it ended up being a terrible deal when you think about just the vast amounts of money that were made from that show.
How much? How would you calculate that?
There were a lot of revenue streams. HBO made a ton of money for that because that was like peak DVD era also, where if you had a successful series, like in addition to all of the new subscribers that HBO got, they also would every season make a collector DVD series and sell it to you for some absurd amount of money, like $100 for like 8 discs, and you'd be like, "Woo! I got one season for $100."
How much
pure
would
money
Darren Star have made from that show?
Just a lot more than $100,000. I mean,
more than 100 million.
No, I don't know. I mean, you have to also think about the movies that came out afterwards. I don't think he made $100 million, but tens of millions of dollars, that seems more reasonable. And HBO made a ton of money. And I think, Candace looks back at that and feels like it was, she got a terrible deal out of that. She was not coming from the world of television. She didn't really even care that much about the television side of it, to be honest. It's just kind of funny to look back at that side. And part of the fun of interviewing her and hearing about her experience was just how little she cared about where the TV rights were going to end up, or, it was just so...
But she sold a bunch of extra books off that too, right?
Yeah, she did. And she had much success afterwards also. So
she turned out fine.
Yeah, she did fine.
But relatively speaking,
it
follows part of a pattern that we didn't get to talk to today, but maybe some other time
about like how
HBO favored male founders and male geniuses.
Very much so,
and you could argue Candace Bushnell was a woman.
I think
genius
it is part of a broader pattern that played out that before we wrote the book on HBO, it was really not something I was aware of or even how we pitched the book, but it was one of the most fascinating things about learning about HBO's history was just how incredibly sexist and misogynist of an environment, existed at Time Warner and Hollywood in the 70s and 80s and how that impacted all these incredibly talented women who were executives and show creators who passed through there. And also what you ended up seeing on the screen, and really a legacy that continues to this day. I mean, I think a lot of it was very explicit in HBO's early days that it was conceived of as a network for men and pandered a lot of times to male tastes. And then over time, that idea did become less explicit. But in some ways, I think you can still find the kernels of that in the culture at the company today and also in what you see on the screen.
Well, I mean, the company today is Warner Brothers Discovery, which is run by David Zaslav, who notoriously does these guys' dinners out in the Hamptons. The entire senior management is all men.
Yes.
I mean, is it even more male heavy now than it was before?
I would say at a corporate level, yes. Within the HBO specifically network, I think one of the good things about HBO now is that they're much, the program inside is really, Casey is the head of it, but there's women who are running comedy, documentaries, drama, and I think you see how important that is when you see how many more female protagonists you have on the screen.
Big Little Lies.
Big Little Lies, Mayor of Easton, Hacks, I May Destroy You, Sharp Objects. There really has been a huge shift towards female protagonists, often investigating the misdeeds of terrible men. I will say the caveat to that whole thing, and on one hand you say, well, it's great progress and it's not just the same male anti-hero in every single one of these shows. At the same time, it is amazing when you start looking at it, how many of those shows, particularly the dramas, still have male creators and male showrunners. And the largesse that HBO famously gives to its creators in terms of creative freedom really has not extended to women. I mean, and it's really a shame because, it's crazy when you look back. I mean, one of the people we interviewed for the book that I found fascinating was Cynthia Mort, who is still to this day, one of the few women who created a hour-long drama for HBO, Tell Me You Love Me. And, when you talk to her about that experience, she just says, it's just every decision goes against women at that network, and there's a huge legacy of it.
Do you have a number?
Since we were talking about the subject, I thought a good number to remind everyone of was $246 million, which is what David Zaslav, his compensation for 2021.
Wow.
$246 million. Okay. So as we enter this era of streaming austerity, which we've all watched somewhat with horror over the past couple months, we got to, HBO Max has to tighten its belt and, we got to get serious and stop spending so much money. And we're going to remove shows from this streaming service, and which is just really unfair and terrible to the creators and the artists who worked on these shows, who sold them to HBO and HBO Max. To see their work removed, I think is awful. And it's, I think, particularly galling to people to have to go through this. The company's going to save some money, that there's tax benefits and they don't have to pay out these residuals to actors and creators and crew members. And it is a little bit galling when you look back at how much money is being made by the people at the top of this company. And I think the $246 million for 1 year, 2021, leading up to this creation of Warner Brothers Discovery really sticks in my craw a little bit.
I mean, yeah. I think $5 million a week seems about fair. I normally allow the guest to go last when it comes to the numbers round, but I'm keeping my number for last because really it's like a softball alley-oop for you. Mm-hmm. My number is 1965, which is a year, and it is a sports-related number. It is the year that pickleball was invented.
Wow.
By three friends of Bill Gates Sr.
Yes.
in Washington. this is going to wind up taking over the world, right? It's pickleball.
How did it suddenly? Yeah, 1965. No one's ever heard of this sport for 50 years, and then suddenly the pandemic hits, and suddenly everyone is playing pickleball, and it's exploding, and millions of people are deciding they want to become late in life pickleball players, and all these networks are rushing to add pickleball leagues, and you have LeBron James going out to buy a pickleball team, and Gary Vee, I just saw he picked up a pickleball team. It's like after you get your NFTs and you get your Bitcoin and your various your cryptocurrencies, like the next thing you have to do is then invest in pickleball. And it does feel very 2022-ish. And it is kind of bizarre a little bit that I don't know if I can think of an equivalent of a sport that was invented, did nothing for half a century, and suddenly caught fire.
Can I just ask, what is pickleball? How do you play it? Really, all I know is it's like noisy.
Why is it called pickleball?
Yeah,
can you just explain it to me?
So it's basically a smaller version of tennis with like oversized table tennis racket.
Yeah,
that's it.
And a wiffle ball.
So it's like easier to hit the ball.
Yeah.
It's easier to hit the ball.
And you don't move around as much.
You don't have to move around as much.
I get it.
It started off with like in the Sun Belt with retirees.
It started out in literally in like Seattle
Mm-hmm.
with Bill Gates' dad. And Bill Gates has been playing pickleball all of his life.
Another deal with the devil, clearly.
On which note, I think we'll wrap up the main part of this show. Felix, thanks for coming on. It's been so much fun.
My pleasure.
We are going to have a Slate Plus segment on Felix. This is coming up on YouTube.
Nice.
But for everyone else, thanks for listening. Thanks for sending in your emails to slatemoney@slate.com. Thanks to the combination of Jessamine Molli and Anna Phillips for producing. And we will be back next week with more Slate Money.
Shouldn't you thank Ben for working the board?
Oh, and thanks, Ben, for working the board.
Hey, everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs. Vic said something.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.